Hello, everyone. I'm Margarita Pinton Perez, and I'm the Community Partnership Leader with the Learning Network at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. On behalf of the Learning Network, welcome to this special event supporting survivors at the intersection of mental health and gender-based violence, Approaches for Practice, presented by Eva Zachary. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Next slide, please. We acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and hosting this virtual event on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenampewak, and Chunnington nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Today, this land continues to be home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We give our deep respect to the first inhabitants of this land and recognize that an acknowledgement of Indigenous land and sovereignty comes with the responsibility to understand the history and the ongoing impacts of settler colonialism. These impacts continue to be felt in disproportionate and everyday ways against Indigenous communities. We also reflect on those who came to this land involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands because of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. As the Learning Network is focused on mobilizing knowledge to end gender-based violence, we also recognize that today, Indigenous people face disproportionate forms of gender-based violence and a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA+ peoples. We recognize the responsibility for our work to be informed of the colonial imprint and harms and the shape that shapes the experiences of GBV among Indigenous communities, and we commit to furthering our work in ways that best uphold solidarity with Indigenous survivors and those supporting them. Next slide, please. I'd like to now introduce our speaker for today's special event. We are so thrilled to be joined by Eva Zachary. Eva Zachary is the Executive Director of Muskoka Victim Services and a longtime advocate for survivors with more than 15 years of experience in conflict resolution, crisis intervention, victim advocacy, and community collaboration. She holds designations as a community and workplace traumologist, trauma services specialist, and compassion fatigue educator, and is certified in meditation and critical incident stress management. Eva is a member of the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee with the Office of the Chief Coroner, serves on the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police Victim Assistance Committee, and advises the Ontario Network of Victim Service Providers. In her independent practice, she also provides mediation services and training to frontline workers and social service providers. Her full bio can be accessed with the link that was just shared in the chat. Eva, it's such a privilege to welcome you to this special event. We're really honored to have you here with us today to share your expertise and your insights. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Eva Zachary. And Eva, I'll hand it over to you now for your presentation.
Thank you, Margarita. Next slide, please. And next slide. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you today from Muskoka, Ontario, Canada, on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe peoples, including the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. These lands and waters have been cared for since time immemorial. I honor the enduring presence, resilience, and contributions of Indigenous peoples, and I recognize the responsibility we each carry to learn, reflect, and build respectful relationships moving forward. Next slide. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this important discussion. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the deep commitment, skill, and adaptability that frontline workers bring to this work every day. Supporting survivors at the intersection of mental health and gender-based violence requires both compassion and expertise, and it often means responding to complex situations while working with systemic limitations that shape what resources, training, and service structures are available. Today's session is a practice-focused, high-level conversation for frontline workers. We'll be exploring the realities, pressures, and possibilities possibilities that show up when survivors are navigating crisis, co-occurring concerns, stigma, and trauma responses, and when service providers are trying to offer meaningful support across systems that don't always align. Please know that I am not a mental health clinician, counselor, psychotherapist, or psychiatrist. This session will not cover diagnosis or treatment planning. The goal is to strengthen shared understanding and practical trauma-informed responses within our frontline roles. I'll be drawing on my experience in crisis intervention, trauma services, and victim advocacy, as well as insights from provincial committee work, including the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee in Ontario, Canada. I won't be speaking about specific cases, but I will highlight patterns that consistently emerge across frontline practice, case reviews, and cross-sector collaboration. Thanks again for your time and for the work that you do. So let's begin. This slide highlights the difference between intimate partner violence and gender-based violence, terms that are often used interchangeably, but that mean different things. Intimate partner violence, or IPV, refers specifically to abuse that occurs within a current or former intimate relationship. The focus is on patterns of harm, control, and coercion between partners. Gender-based violence, or GBV, is broader. It refers to violence that is rooted in gender inequality, power imbalances, and social norms, and it can occur in many settings, not only within intimate relationships. GBV is upheld by structural inequities such as sexism, racism, colonialism, ableism, homophobia, and transphobia. IPV can be a form of GBV when it is driven by gendered power dynamics, but not all IPV automatically fits under GBV. Understanding this distinction helps us better assess risk, respond appropriately, and design prevention strategies that address both individual harm and systemic conditions. Next slide, please. What we're seeing across Ontario and Canada is not a lack of commitment or skill among service providers. It's quite the opposite. Frontline workers across GBV, mental health, and allied sectors are demonstrating an extraordinary level of adaptability, compassion, and problem solving as survivor needs become more complex. Survivors are increasingly presenting while navigating crisis, co-occurring concerns, stigma, and trauma responses. Many are managing multiple systems at once, such as housing instability, legal processes, child welfare involvement, mental health care, and safety planning, often with limited access to timely or coordinated supports. At the same time, providers are doing this work within systemic constraints. Mandates differ across sectors, resources are stretched, training opportunities vary. Service structures don't always align in ways that support smooth transition or shared understanding. These realities can create gaps or inconsistencies in response, even when everyone involved is acting in good faith. This matters because when trauma responses or mental health concerns are misunderstood, survivors may experience delays, dismissal, or harm, not intentionally, but as a result of how systems are organized. These moments can affect safety, trust, and help seeking in very real ways. At the same time, this moment also holds possibility. Strengthening shared understanding, trauma, and violence-informed approaches in cross-sector communication creates opportunities for more consistent, compassionate, and empowering support for survivors. Today's session is about naming the pressures honestly, recognizing the strengths that already exist in frontline work, and exploring how collaboration and aligned practice can improve outcomes, even when we can't change the systems overnight. Next slide, please. When we talk about the intersection of mental health and gender-based violence, it's important to ground ourselves in shared understanding. Mental health concerns often emerge within the context of trauma, fear, and ongoing violence. Survivors may present with anxiety, panic, emotional overwhelm, difficulty concentrating, memory gaps, or heightened fear responses. These experiences are not separate from the violence. In fact, they are often direct responses to it. What we are seeing is frequently adaptation, not pathology. At this intersection, trauma responses can be misunderstood. Survivors who appear confused, withdrawn, emotional, or hesitant may be perceived as unreliable or noncompliant, when these behaviors often reflect nervous system responses shaped by fear and coercion. It's also critical to name that trauma and violence do not occur in a vacuum. Experiences of racism, colonialism, ableism, poverty, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and other forms of marginalization shape how violence is experienced, how mental health concerns present, and how survivors are responded to by systems. A trauma and violence-informed approach is also an anti-oppressive one. It asks us to pay attention to whose experiences are more likely to be dismissed, minimized, or pathologized. Next slide, please. In this slide, I want to share some patterns that emerge across frontline practice, case reviews, and cross-sector collaboration. This is not to assign blame, but to support learning and prevention. Through my participation on provincial committees, including the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, as well as through frontline work, we can consistently see how mental health concerns and trauma responses can complicate how risk is understood and addressed. One common pattern is that mental health concerns, particularly fear, confusion, emotional intensity, or dissociation, can unintentionally obscure risk. When a survivor presents as highly distressed or overwhelmed, the focus may shift towards managing mental health systems rather than fully exploring the broader context of violence, coercion, or escalation. We also see trauma responses being misinterpreted. Survivors may appear hesitant, inconsistent, withdrawn, or uncertain. Without a trauma-informed lens, these responses can be misunderstood as indecision or lack of engagement, rather than recognized as indicators of fear or survival strategies. Another recurring theme is system fragmentation. Survivors often interact with multiple services that operate under different mandates, thresholds, and assumptions. When information isn't shared or when services work in parallel rather than collaboratively, critical pieces of the survivor's experience may be missed. What's important to emphasize is that these patterns reflect systemic challenges, not individual failures. They highlight opportunities to strengthen shared understanding, improve communication across sectors, and respond to complexity in ways that enhance survivor safety and dignity. This is where trauma and violence-informed practice, combined with thoughtful collaboration, becomes not just helpful, but essential. Next slide, please. Trauma and violence-informed practice, or TVI, provides a foundation for responding to complexity without blame or oversimplification. This approach recognizes that trauma and violence shape how people think, feel, behave, and engage with systems. When survivors present with distress, confusion, or difficulty engaging, TVI practice invites us to see these responses as adaptations to harm rather than signs of resistance or disorder. TVI practice prioritizes safety, emotional, psychological, cultural, and relational, alongside choice and autonomy, particularly in systems where survivors may already feel controlled or disempowered. It also acknowledges that systems and structures matter. For survivors who have experienced racism, colonial violence, ableism, or discrimination, including Indigenous, Black, racialized, newcomer, disabled, or 2S LGBTQIA+ survivors, trauma responses may also reflect learned strategies for staying safe in systems that have not always been protective. Next slide, please. To respond effectively at the intersection of mental health and gender-based violence, it's important to understand how trauma shows up in the body and nervous system. Trauma responses are not conscious decisions. They are automatic, protective reactions that help a person survive in situations that feel dangerous or overwhelming. When someone has experienced violence, coercion, or chronic fear, their nervous system may remain on high alert, even in spaces that are intended to be supportive. Many of us are familiar with the concepts of fight, flight, and freeze, but it can be helpful to briefly name what these might look like in frontline settings. A survivor in flight mode may appear angry, defensive, or confrontational. A flight response may show up as panic, restlessness, or a strong urge to leave. Freeze looks like silence, numbness, difficulty responding, or appearing stuck. We also see fawn responses, which involve people-pleasing, minimizing harm, or focusing on meeting others' needs as a way to stay safe. And we see dissociation, where a survivor may seem detached, confused, slow to respond, or disconnected from the present moment. These responses can shift depending on who the survivor is with, what questions are being asked, and how safe they feel. Importantly, none of these responses reflect a lack of credibility, motivation, or cooperation. They reflect a nervous system doing exactly what it learned to do to survive. When we recognize trauma responses for what they are, we're better equipped to respond with patience, clarity, and compassion, rather than unintentionally escalating distress or misinterpreting behavior. Next slide, please. When survivors present to services, mental health concerns are often shaped by trauma, chronic stress, and ongoing fear, not simply by individual vulnerability. Survivors may experience anxiety, panic, sleep disruption, intrusive thoughts, emotional overwhelm, or hopelessness. Some may use substances as a way to cope or remain functional in unsafe circumstances. Presentations can fluctuate. A survivor may appear composed in one setting and overwhelmed in another, depending on safety, power dynamics, and context. It's also important to remember that outward stability does not mean low risk. Survivors who appear organized or calm may be expending significant effort to manage fear or maintain control. Mental health presentations are not indicators of credibility. They reflect the conditions survivors are navigating. Next slide, please. Stigma plays a powerful role in the intersection of mental health and gender-based violence, and it can significantly shape how survivors experience support and whether they continue to seek it. Survivors who disclose mental health concerns may be viewed as less credible, less reliable, or less capable of making decisions. Trauma responses such as emotional intensity, confusion, withdrawal, or ambivalence may be interpreted as resistance, exaggeration, or lack of commitment to change. These interpretations are often unintentional, but they can have real consequences for safety and trust. Stigma can also show up when survivors return to an abusive relationship, struggle to follow through with plans, or use substances to cope. Without a trauma and violence-informed lens, these behaviors may be framed as poor choices rather than understood as survival strategies shaped by fear, coercion, and limited options. The impact of stigma is not just emotional. It can affect access to services, quality of responses, and a survivor's willingness to disclose risk. When survivors feel judged or dismissed, they may stop sharing information that is critical for safety planning. Reducing stigma with how we interpret behavior and reducing stigma begins with how we interpret behavior and how we respond. When we approach survivors with curiosity, validation, and respect rather than assumptions, we create conditions for engagement, honesty, and trust. These conditions are foundational for both safety and healing. When survivors are overwhelmed, distressed, or in crisis, how we show up in the moment matters as much as what we say. Trauma and violence-informed strategies help regulate the nervous system and reduce escalation, even when circumstances are complex. Culturally safe responses are essential. For Black, Indigenous, racialized, newcomer, disabled, and 2SL LGBTQIA+ survivors, grounding approaches must account for past harm, surveillance, or discrimination within systems. Safety is not a one-size-fits-all. One of the most powerful tools we have is our presence, slowing our speech, softening our tone, and reducing urgency can help signal safety. Using simple, clear language and avoiding jargons or rapid questioning makes it easier for survivors to stay grounded and engaged. Validation is another key strategy. Naming that a survivor's response makes sense in the context of what they've experienced can be profoundly regulating. Statements like, "This reaction is very understandable given what you're dealing with," or "You're not overreacting. This is a common trauma response." These statements can help reduce shame and defensiveness. Offering choice whenever possible also supports regulation and autonomy. Even small choices like where to sit, whether to take a pause, what to focus on first, can restore a sense of control in situations where survivors often feel powerless. These strategies are relational, practical, and within frontline scope. They help restore dignity, choice, and connection, often in moments when survivors feel least in control. When used consistently, they can reduce distress, strengthen trust, and create the conditions needed for safer decision-making. When survivors are in crisis, our role is not to solve everything at once. It's to help create enough stability and safety in the moment for the survivor to take the next step, whatever that step needs to be. Crisis can look different depending on the context. A survivor may be overwhelmed by fear, experiencing escalating violence, struggling with suicidal thoughts, or feeling completely stuck. In these moments, calm and consistency from the service provider are essential. Supporting survivors in crisis means prioritizing immediate safety while remaining grounded in trauma and violence-informed principles. This includes slowing the pace, checking in about what feels most urgent right now, and avoiding language that pressures a survivor into decisions that they may not be ready or able to make. It's especially important to avoid ultimatums or rigid pathways when someone is in crisis. Statements that feel controlling or punitive, even when well-intentioned, can increase fear and disengagement. Instead, we aim for collaborative planning, where the survivor's perspective, concerns, and priorities are centered. Crisis support is relational. When survivors feel safer in the interaction, they are better able to engage, share information, and consider options. Many survivors of gender-based violence are navigating more than one risk at the same time. These risks can include escalating violence, mental health distress, suicidal thoughts, substance use, housing instability, health concerns, or isolation. Rarely do these risks exist in isolation. More often, they interact and compound one another. For example, a survivor may be using substances to cope with trauma while also experiencing increased violence at home. Another survivor may be suicidal because they feel trapped between unsafe housing, limited income, and fear of further harm. These situations are complex, and they don't lend themselves to simple or linear solutions. When risks coexist, our role is not to rank one concern as more legitimate than the other, but to hold the full picture. Trauma and violence-informed practice asks us to balance safety, autonomy, and capacity, recognizing that survivors are often making decisions with very real constraints. This is where curiosity becomes critical. We can ask, what feels most unsafe right now? What options feel possible? Who else might help support the survivor? These questions help guide thoughtful responses without overriding survivor's choice. Navigating co-occurring risks also reinforces the importance of collaboration. No single service can address every need. Working alongside mental health providers, housing supports, crisis services, and community partners helps create more coordinated and informed responses, even when systems are imperfect. Complexity does not mean failure. It means the situation deserves patience, collaboration, and care. Survivors experiencing gender-based violence and mental health challenges are rarely interacting with just one system. Many are navigating multiple services at the same time, such as GBV supports, mental health providers, housing services, healthcare, police, child welfare, and income supports, each with different mandates, thresholds, and expectations. These differences don't reflect a lack of care or effort. They reflect how our systems have evolved separately over time. When mandates and approaches aren't aligned, survivors may experience gaps, conflicting information, or inconsistent responses, even when everyone involved is acting with good intentions. Strengthening cross-sector collaboration doesn't mean blurring roles or overstepping scope. It means building shared understanding, clarifying responsibilities, and communicating in ways that reduce duplication and confusion for survivors. Simple practices such as warm referrals, coordinated check-ins, or shared language around trauma and safety can make a meaningful difference. Collaboration also supports frontline workers. When communication is stronger across sectors, workers are less isolated in decision-making and better able to respond to complexity with confidence. It creates opportunities to hold risk collectively rather than expecting one service or one person to manage it alone. Ultimately, collaboration is about alignment, aligning around survivor safety, autonomy, and dignity, even when systems remain imperfect. When sectors work together thoughtfully, survivors experience more consistent, compassionate, and empowering support. It's important to pause here and name something clearly. Frontline work happens with very real systemic pressures. These pressures shape what's possible even when commitment, skill, and care are deeply present. Across sectors, workers are navigating limited resources, long wait lists, staffing shortages, and eligibility criteria that don't always align with the complexity survivors are experiencing. Mandates can be narrow, funding can be unstable, and services are often asked to do more with less. This reality can create moral distress. That feeling of knowing what would help, but not always being able to provide it within the constraints of the system. Over time, this can contribute to burnout, exhaustion, and a sense of carrying responsibility that feels too heavy to hold alone. Naming these pressures is not about lowering expectations or excusing harm. It's about acknowledging context. When we recognize the systemic conditions shaping frontline work, we're better able to support each other, advocate for change, and avoid placing unrealistic expectations on individual workers. Caring for survivors and caring for ourselves are not competing priorities. Sustainability matters because safe, compassionate, trauma-informed responses depend on a workforce that is supported, valued, and not asked to absorb the weight of the systemic gaps on their own. As we move towards closing, I want to shift our focus on what's working and what's possible, even within the constraints we've named. Across Ontario and Canada, we're seeing promising practices emerge. Trauma and violence-informed approaches are strengthening how survivors are supported. not just at the individual level, but across organizations and systems. When survivors are met with consistency, respect, and choice, engagement increases and harm is reduced. Collaboration continues to be one of the most powerful tools we have. When sectors communicate more effectively, share understanding, and align around common principles, particularly safety, autonomy, and dignity, survivors experience fewer gaps and more continuity and support. It's also important to recognize that meaningful change doesn't always require large-scale reform. Small shifts in practice, such as slowing down conversation, validating trauma responses, offering choice, and using shared language can have a significant impact on how safe and supported a survivor feels. Alignment across sectors is an ongoing process, not a destination. It requires curiosity, humility, and relationship building. But every step towards alignment strengthens the collective response to gender-based violence and mental health complexity. Let me close with this thought. The work you do matters. The care you bring matters. And together, through thoughtful, trauma-informed practice and collaboration, we can continue to create safer, more compassionate pathways for survivors. As we close, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the survivors and victims whose experiences inform this work. Much of what we know about gender-based violence, trauma, and risk has come directly from the courage of survivors who have shared their stories, often at great personal cost. Their experiences have shaped research, informed practice, and guided system-level learning aimed at prevention and safety. We also honor those whose lives have been lost to violence. Their lives matter. Their experiences matter, and the lessons drawn from case reviews and system learning carry responsibility to respond more thoughtfully, more collaboratively, and with greater compassion. This work is not abstract. It is grounded in real lives, real harm, and real resilience. As frontline workers and service providers, we both carry both the privilege and responsibility of translating this learning into action. May we continue this work with humility, care, and commitment to honoring survivor voices, not only in how we respond, but how we advocate for safer systems and stronger supports. I want to close by offering my sincere thanks to the Learning Network at Western University for creating this space for this important conversation and for recognizing the value of practice-focused trauma and violence-informed dialogue across sectors. I also want to thank each of you for the work you do every day. Supporting survivors at the intersection of mental health and gender-based violence is complex, emotionally demanding, and deeply meaningful. Your commitment, care, and professionalism make a real difference, even when the impact isn't always immediately visible. I've left for you today my contact information at Muskoka Victim Services and also for my private practice. The Learning Network will be sharing handouts and resources for you today, and they can also be found on my website. I've also created an article to complement today's presentation, and you can find that under my blog on my website. On that note, we will now move into time for questions. Thanks again for being here and for the work that you do.
Thank you so much, Eva, for such a thoughtful and grounded session on supporting survivors at the intersection of mental health and GBV. I'm hoping that you can hear me all right, Eva, because I'm getting notice that my internet connection is unstable, so I'm hoping it's okay.
I
I
can
thought
hear
it was real
you.
wonderful. I thought it was so valuable to hear you speak, to the realities and the pressures that service providers are facing, and then highlighting, trauma and violence informed, non-pathologizing responses when mental health concerns are present. And I'm really glad you mentioned the handout that you developed to accompany this talk today. I think it really translates, a lot of these ideas into accessible, practice-based guidance that people will be able to refer to in their day-to-day work. So we do have some time to move us into the Q&A. Um, and so we welcome folks to continue to submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best as well to respond to as many questions as possible. So, Eva, I'm going to start with a question that came in. Someone was wondering if you could maybe share an example or a form of IPV, and this is related maybe to your opening, thinking about a form of IPV that would not maybe be considered GBV.
Well, when an example would be if you have IPV would be isolated solely as IPV. The simple example would be a husband and a wife, they have a family unit, and there's power imbalances and violence within that family network. That would be considered IPV.
So you were helping people make that distinction of IPV as a form of GBV and then also talking about it GBV more broadly. I think
Correct.
that, okay, wonderful. Just in your opening, you were wanting to make that distinction. Um, as you were presenting on things that service providers might be able to reflect on, or thinking about what's being presented and trying to understand what might be happening for the person, for a survivor, for someone that you're supporting in the moment, there's a question that came in that says, what questions can service providers ask themselves to reflect in that moment when interpreting how people are showing up? And I think that's a really great question.
That is a great question. I think when we take the moment to really listen to the person who's sitting in front of us and hearing their entire story, giving them the space to tell their story, those moments will also provide opportunities for questions that we can or should ask. And part of this also is not overthinking the process. It is taking the time to pause and to listen effectively to everything that they're sharing at that time. Because as you're having a conversation, you are going to see changes in their body language. They're going to build trust with sitting in the same room with you. And with time, they're also going to be sharing more. I often use the analogy of an onion. And as you can picture, an onion has many layers. And sometimes when you're starting to work with that onion, it's difficult to open up. And then once you do, you see how many layers are underneath. And that takes time. Uh, and once you build that relationship, those questions will come to you. But if you make the time to sit in silence, and that is the hardest thing to do because we often want to fill those gaps and make sure that there's no silence available. But those moments of silence are very important for both the survivor and for the frontline worker, because then you both have an opportunity to reflect on what's been said and what's next. And also will provide, I think it's also important to circle back to ask the survivor what they need. What's right for them at that moment? How are they feeling? Do they need to have a pause? Do they need to have a drink of water? Uh, and then when you talk about options for support, give them the time to think about it. Time is of essence because that also builds security and trust.
I love that. Thank you, Eva. The time, the listening, all of those as part of this process. And I do appreciate your analogy as well. You know, the next question, we are talking about coordination and collaboration, and I think also for people thinking about, the reality of the context that they're working in and potentially some of those limitations. And so someone here was asking, how can service providers navigate their own role limitations while still contributing to coordinated, survivor-centered response planning across different sectors, for example, health, legal, social services, some of those examples that you shared.
One thing that's critical as a frontline worker is being honest to yourself, being honest to the survivor that you're supporting, and being honest to the service providers that you're working with. Identifying what those limitations are within the capacity and the scope of the work that you're doing is important because that also establishes boundaries. And as I mentioned in the presentation, is not one organization, not one agency, not one frontline worker can do all of this themselves. So when you sit with the survivor and with your community partners, it's important to identify those limitations because then you're not setting up any false expectations. You're putting it on the table, and then it also provides an opportunity for everyone around the table, all the community partners that you're collaborating with, to say, all right, you can't make that gap, but I can, and this is how. And then you start drawing that larger picture. I hope that provides some clarity to that question.
I think that was helpful to imagine it. And I do like what you're reminding us here of this being collective and collaborative in terms of how we approach it. Um, there's a question here about how organizations and institutions might ensure that their policies are actively working to support survivors and are not inadvertently perpetuating harm or re-traumatization, which is a big question, important
Mhm.
question.
This one, so governance, so this goes to leadership and those organizations that also have board of directors. It's very important to have a strong board of directors that oversees the governance piece as well. Um, and the reason why I say this is it is important that organizations review their policies and procedures at least on an annual basis to review if they are meeting the current system demands. And if they are not meeting the current system demands, then how can those policies and procedures be modified to better support the survivors that you're supporting? What's important to stress, because I know I'm sure there's a few leaders sitting in the group cringing because policies and procedures is not a very glorious task. It can sometimes be an onerous task, and it tends to be left to the side of the table. And um, and some of our policies and procedures for organizations can be considered even outdated. So I'm thankful for this conversation because it brings forward to the leadership that is sitting at this presentation today is the policies and procedures and protocols matter. There's the policies and procedures, but there's also the written and unwritten protocols that frontline workers will have right from the front line right up to the leadership. And there has to be that mutual understanding that everyone is in sync with the current policies and procedures. And also frontline workers should also have the ability to communicate to leadership when policies and procedures provide or are constraining to the services that they're doing. I understand that there has to be boundaries. And going back again to the presentation, it's not about overstepping roles. It's not about overstepping boundaries or mandates. It's modifying and tweaking, just the fine tuning the policies that better support the survivors.
Thank you, Eva. And I actually, there's another question here, um, maybe similar in terms of thinking about how can we build and encourage collaboration. For example, when organizations might have diverging mandates and goals in some areas. Um, so the person that submitted this question was thinking, for example, of like the criminal justice system, those supports and then community-based supports. And I feel like you may have from your own experience, maybe some examples of how to navigate that.
That is an excellent question. I do have an example in our small community in Muskoka, Ontario, that I'll share. I think, but before I share that example, one critical aspect of collaboration is removing the ego building trust, building relationships with your community partners, and recognizing that you're not going to operate in silos. That would be step one. From there, I'll use an example that we use in Muskoka here. We have what is called the Group of Five. And for us, it is a small group of organizations that work at the critical intersection when a crisis happens and in the recovery phase of an incident. And our Group of Five involves Muskoka Victim Services, the District of Muskoka, which has housing and homelessness supports. And we have two Salvation Armies in our community, and those will be the first organizations to support at the moment of crisis. And then through the recovery phase, we will be then building on that and pulling in other organizations. One thing that you often hear is a helpful approach is to create memorandums of understanding with other organizations. And it could be in written format it bounds both organizations to say, this is what I can provide, this is what you can provide, and this is how we meet in between. And those memorandums are helpful, but they also create limitations as well, especially if there might be some um, overreach in terms of support. So, but just circling back, we've come a very long way. If you asked me this question 15 years ago, I would have told you that we're all operating in silos and that's that. No one talks to anyone else. We have come, at least in Ontario and across Canada, we have come a long way to open up dialogue and have that more collaborative approach. One thing that I'll add to in regards to the collaboration piece as well is confidentiality. Each organization has its own policies and procedures regarding confidentiality of when you can share information and where you cannot share information. I strongly encourage everyone that's here today that if you are working with a survivor and there are significant safety concerns, you may have to modify your confidentiality policies for the better interest of that survivor's safety. And what that looks like can be a discussion between organizations. It doesn't mean that you're dropping the guard and you're disclosing everything. You can have that on conversation ahead of time on what that would look like. But I think it's important. We have been very constrained by our confidentiality clauses, which have been detrimental to survivor safety. And I do believe that it's time that we shift that focus and step out of those silos and work with what is most concerning at this time.
Thank you, Eva. And that's very like practical information of something that organizations can be doing and applying. Um, I just want to check in with you. We do have some more questions to go through, if that's okay.
I'm
Um,
fine.
great. So there's some questions that are thinking about, working with people who are in active crisis or how people might be showing up in certain settings. So I'm kind of going to shift us into some of those questions.
Okay.
Um, I'm going to start with a question that says, what are some strategies or techniques to help prepare a survivor to deal with the trauma responses in a setting where we may know that these responses may be activated, like a courtroom or an examination under oath? But we know also that leaving that situation is not an option.
Leaving that situation in terms of leaving the relationship, kind
I
of,
believe
or
here they might mean that these are examples, like, for example, in a courtroom or in an examination under oath, where they are part of these situations they might not be able to leave in.
and it may be re-traumatizing and it just a perpetual cycle. Okay. I think, and this is why we all have our specialized roles. You have victim services that are the crisis workers, and we're not in the courtrooms. And then you have victim witness assistance programs do support survivors going into the courtroom. And we'll just use the criminal justice system as an example. when, be it either the frontline crisis worker or those going into a courtroom setting, it is very important to prepare survivors for what they will be walking into, giving them scenarios, giving them a sense of what they will experience. So, for victim services, for example, when a responder works with a survivor and there may be some medical appointments, or they may need to see a clinic to collect some evidence to support police investigation. A crisis responder can also say, this is what you're going into, these are what your choices are, and this is what it may feel like. And sometimes it may be exploring all five senses. This is what you're going to hear. This is what you're going to see. This is what the room will smell like. This is, and just giving them, helping them be mentally prepared for what they're going to walk in on, but not dismissing the fact that their trauma responses will be gone. You can also circle back to say, this is what you're walking in on, but please be prepared. You may have moments where you're going to feel angry, you're going to be sad, you're going to cry, you're going to want to scream, and those are all valid and rational trauma responses. The same will be in a criminal justice system before they go in front of a judge, or preparing someone that they're going to be walking into a courtroom and the perpetrator may be there, and what will helping them prepare themselves to ground themselves and feel fully supported before they walk into that environment. I think that mental preparation is critical for the long-term well-being and for of the survivor.
Thank you, Eva. And I feel like how you responded to this question may be helpful for folks who submitted questions. And I'll give you this example, but there was another one that did come in thinking about how some survivors, for example, if they may have racing thoughts, or it may be difficult to share accounts of what's taken place. For example, for when reaching out to a family lawyer was an example provided. And so it may sometimes discourage lawyers from taking on cases. It may make it challenging and complicated, right? And so the question there was, what could I recommend or suggest to a client, when they are trying to find a family lawyer? And I'm thinking a bit about what you're talking about here, also preparation, and supporting people along the way. I don't know if you want to add anything there to that specific example.
I do. So part of all of our roles is to help empower the survivor to take that next step, because in reality, they're the ones that are going to be the ones that have to call the shelter. They're the ones that are going to be the that are required to call the family lawyer themselves or criminal lawyer. And part of our role as frontline workers is one, to educate them on what they're going to experience, but also we can help them in their presentation. And what I mean by that is when they go to meet with a lawyer for the first time, it can be a very intimidating experience. Very, very intimidating experience, because these lawyers are fast-paced, fast talkers. You have 20 minutes, you're in and out, give me the documents you need, we're done. Not a very trauma-informed practice. But when a survivor goes in knowing that they may shut down, they may have certain reactions, they can begin their meeting. We were saying just with a family lawyer, they can begin that meeting by introducing themselves and saying, just so that you are aware, this is a recent incident that occurred. This is what I'm experiencing right now. I may have moments where I'm going to shut down. I may have moments where I'm going to cry. But I'm here. I am committed to the process, but I may need a moment to breathe. And putting that out forward, usually for those service providers that are really fast-paced and rapid fire, it should provide them an opportunity to sit back and go, okay, this person is not, like as I said in the presentation, it doesn't mean that they're exhibiting that they're not committed and that they're not reliable and they're not following through. It's that they are experiencing trauma responses in the immediate aftermath of an incident. And I, as a frontline worker, as a lawyer, am going to have to step back and take a breath and give them the time.
Thank you, Eva. That is really helpful. I'm going to there's two questions here, and I see a connection in these questions, so I'm going to do my best to bring them together. Um, Here we've been talking about like specific context or this example with family lawyers or example of like a court setting. And there's a next question that brings it back to maybe that initial meeting with survivors or that first connection that service providers may have. So, do you have, someone here was asking, where do you turn, Eva, for helpful, TVI-based language to utilize and to apply when working with clients? And a question about, do you have a practice that you might be willing to share for how you start or even ground clients at the beginning of a meeting? So I'll let you go there and then maybe I'll follow up with this question where I see another connection as
There's a two-part answer to this. So, one, common practices for when you're meeting with someone for the very first time. And I'm speaking through a victim services lens where we are meeting with someone in the immediate aftermath of an incident. And usually our common practice is to come in and introduce ourselves. We should always start very slow. We introduce ourselves, who we are, what we do, what the supports are within the program. And then before we dive in, and we also share that we're there not to re-traumatize them. We're not there to make things worse. We're there to help stabilize and to mobilize. And what I mean by that is we're there to be a support at the moment and then carry them through to bring in the appropriate people and organizations that can carry on that support. It's important when you're working with individuals to give pause. And I always talk about giving people time because in the immediate aftermath of an incident, and even in the days, months, weeks, and sometimes years following, they are bombarded with supports, as we mentioned in the presentations, and it can get very overwhelming and very confusing. So when we sit down with someone for the very first time and then have that conversation, giving them time, providing them that pause to let them absorb the information, ask any questions that they have, and ask them where they're at and what they would like to do. Sometimes they might just say, I need a drink of water, I need to go for a smoke, I just need to walk around the block. And then they can choose, do they want you there or not? And also feel comfortable with the uncomfortable. So sometimes you start off by sitting in silence. And that is meeting a survivor where they're at. Give them that silence, give them their space, and give them that time. They will inevitably end up telling you what they need at that moment. And to be honest, I forgot what part two was. Um, Sorry about that.
that's fine. Yeah, thank you, Eva. And and I think you've been able to provide there, that space that's needed and some of the options that can be provided, based on this approach. Um, I'm thinking a bit here about, I want to move us into this other area of questions. So, also to think about, uh, thinking about a service provider's role in terms of documentation and reporting. And I think that's a really valuable question here in terms of what we're discussing and also what we're mentioning about making space. So, I'm going to start with the question here that's says, we know that documentation and assessment processes in frontline organization can create real legal risks for survivors, including subpoena, disclosure, or weaponization by abusive partners. So, the question for you is, how are you thinking about balancing that risk with the use of formal, maybe mental health risk assessment tools that require documentation and classification?
So Um, that's a wonderful question because we have that challenge on a daily basis. And wearing multiple hats, I have the lens of our frontline workers in terms of what they're capturing and what they're documenting. And then I also have the lens of leadership in terms of my role is to protect the survivor and the organization, and recognizing what the liabilities are for frontline and for the legal side of things as well. When it comes to documenting, and we have this conversation like with our staff on a regular basis as well, is it's important to document what is most important. And what I mean by that is identifying, and please keep in mind, I'm not a clinician, and the organization that I lead we're also, none of us are clinicians, so our notes are not clinical. So our notes often are what is the circuit, what is the situation, what are the options for community collaboration, bringing in all the supports that are required, doing that needs assessment, that risk assessment, that vulnerability screening that shows the entire picture of what you're working with. Where I draw a line and encourage others as well is the people that you're serving are going to be disclosing things that could possibly be harmful to their legal case. That doesn't mean that you necessarily have to document it. Unless unless it's going to draw risk to themselves, others, or children. It, I'll give you an example. Sometimes you may have a survivor that will say, you know what? I've been smoking marijuana now consistently 4 times a day for the last 6 months. Could that be potentially harmful to a legal situation? Possibly, depending on context. Is it going to be beneficial for you to put it in your notes? You may want to note that the person that you're working with has used marijuana for coping mechanisms, and having that noted is beneficial for the organization, especially when you have multiple frontline workers working with the same individual, and they can read that in the case notes. What I encourage you to do, though, is finding that boundary of how much is too much. And this circles back to your own organizational policies and procedures and protocols, is what is acceptable information to put into your case notes and what can be left out. And um, because part of our role as well, and again, I'm speaking from the lens of victim services, part of our role is to protect the survivor. And um, setting up those protocols, be it written or unwritten protocols, are essential for the safety of the organization, but also for the safety of the individual you're supporting.
Thank you, Eva. Those are really important measures and important kind of tips in terms of what you're reflecting on. I want to make a connection here too to some questions that were coming up around confidentiality policies. Um, and someone would love to, I'm sure this resonates with others, to hear a little bit more about this thread on confidentiality and some of its constraints that you mentioned in the presentation. If you don't mind, maybe expanding a little bit on that.
I cannot tell you how much I love this discussion because it is something that I have often with our community partners, on the different committees that I sit on provincial committees. And I know this is an ongoing conversation for many people and organizations, and it's also an ongoing bone of contention. You can work with one organization and they have, regardless if you've worked with someone 2 hours before and you were the one that helped connect them to that said organization, that that organization may have a very hard line in terms of once that person walks in this door, that's it. Unless we have a written consent that we can speak with you, we're not crossing that boundary. That is something as much as I cringe over here as well, that is something that you do have to adhere to from a governance side of things. Where I ask you to speak with, I ask you to speak with your coworkers and your management as well. There are opportunities where you can balance respecting the survivor's confidentiality, but also sharing enough information that can help with community collaboration. And what I mean by that is anytime that you are identifying as an organization that there is high risk to an individual, to a family, to a community, I strongly encourage you that those are times where those policies and procedures need to be set aside. Of course, there's still boundaries to be respected, but for the safety of those that you are serving, for the families, for the children, for the community, you must have this conversation within your organization in terms of what would it look like if we're going to potentially breach that confidentiality. And I don't like to use the word breach because if you have someone that is in high risk and there is going to be significant risk of someone reoffending, I firmly believe that you need to step in. It's our role as frontline workers to speak up, to better support and create that safety net for that survivor. I've said this before in other presentations that, and I'm speaking for myself here, that I would rather get my hand slapped saying that you stepped out of the bounds of our confidentiality clause, knowing that I've potentially helped save a life rather than stay quiet because of the constraints of our confidentiality clause and know that someone will or has been harmed. So it's a teeter-totter, but I strongly recommend taking this conversation back to your own organizations. I do want to say, please do honor your policies and procedures and protocols, but having those conversations with fellow staff members and management is critical for how you move forward for the safety of those you serve.
Thank you, Eva. And I'm really glad to hear that you're enjoying also this discussion. And thank you so much. We really value your expertise, your time here. If it's okay, can we just do a couple of more questions?
Sure.
I want to check in with you there. Okay, wonderful. Um, I think this is there's two more questions here I believe we'll have time for. I think this is a really important question to be asking, and it comes from an audience member that's saying, do you have any suggestions on how to assess where to draw the line of continuing to try to engage a survivor in recognition of the possible trauma responses that are posing barriers, or recognizing that it might not be the right time for a survivor to continue services? Um, they're reflecting here on how it might not be, not, I don't think a one size fit all approach to re-engagement attempts and deciding to close a file works, but recognizing that trauma responses has made someone maybe it's not the right time for these supports and services. So I'm wondering if you might be able to reflect on that question.
Absolutely. And that is a fantastic question and often a barrier that many organizations, many frontline workers observe. And sometimes we'll be working with a survivor and they may be presenting significant trauma responses, co-occurring risks. And I said this in the presentation as well, is that really it almost prevents them from making choices and moving forward or even sharing their story. So what's important before you close a file, please, and I say this like, please, 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 if there's one thing that you circle back to is ensure that that person has a circle of care. They may not be able at this present moment to be able to share a story or to access services or have the ability to speak with you within the scope of the work that you do. But I kindly ask, please don't close a file and walk away. Please ensure that they have a circle of care that is appropriate for their needs. If they need mental health support, if it's they need housing supports, go back to their needs. What is it that they need to support them in this moment? And that may also open the door that you don't necessarily end up closing the file. It just might mean that you look at it a month, 2 months from now, when they might be in a better space to speak to you more openly. And I see this a lot, especially when it's with the potential with the criminal justice system or family law. People are hesitant to move forward and they're not in a space to be ready to work, but that doesn't mean that they don't want to. So give them the opportunity to step back from working with you, but please ensure that they have some sort of circle of care that is appropriate for their immediate needs.
Thank you, Eva. And as just as to wrap up, there's been some really fantastic questions that have been submitted by the audience, and so I'll be sure to share those questions also with you, Eva, after today. Um, just to wrap up here, do you have any tips for supporting survivors, supporting other individuals in our work when their situation might activate our own trauma responses?
That is an excellent question. And I was actually going to close off with reminding everyone to look after their own self-care. So the timing is excellent. I think, and again, victim services lens and working with our crisis responders, developing that culture within your organization that gives the frontline worker permission to say, okay, this particular case is triggering me. I'm not in a space to properly support this specific survivor. Um, and this is hard to do because
Hmm.
frontline workers, they're all fixers and helpers and come from a really good space. But we cannot be present for other people if we're harming ourselves. So if there is, and again, and speaking to leadership here, create that culture where your staff can open freely with you. It's not going to be every single case. It may be a one-off case where, I'm talking to Susie, Susie's telling her story, and it's a significant trigger for me for something that I didn't realize was even a trigger. I don't think that I'm going to be the beneficial frontline worker to work with Susie. For leadership, it's important for you to give that space for your staff, I'll acknowledge that trigger and keep your frontline workers safe, emotionally, physically, all encompassing safety, and also reassigning to another caseworker, and then providing the supports for that frontline worker along the way. Creating that culture is vital for the success, the retention of staff. It's incredibly important. Um, the the other part um, is being honest with yourself. Many of us have been doing this work for years, decades. Um, and for those that are just starting out in the field, I strongly recommend circle in with yourself once a day and see where you're at. And protecting your own emotional well-being is critical for your longevity in this field. So it's okay to be honest and say, this one's not for me. I can't do this one. And ensuring that you yourself have your own circle of care um, in creating that culture within the organization. It's vital for the work that we do.
Thank you so much, Eva, for that reminder. That reminder also for, as you mentioned, for leadership for organizations to create that space where someone can come forward and share that as well if they're being activated and need support. Thank you so much, Eva, for this time. We had like an Ask Eva a little bit longer of a Q&A period with you, which we're so pleased with. And, we really value your leadership, your expertise, the time you took to be here with us today. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions, who's engaging with us as well. We really appreciate that as well. Um, Eva, before we sign off here, we're going to just take a moment to share a few closing remarks and share a few brief announcements. So I just want to say thank you so much for being here with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
A special thank you to the Learning Network team behind the scenes, Jenna Lopez, Laura Murray, and thanks also to Mara for the tech support today. And thank you as well to our ASL interpreters, Dean and Carmel. A friendly reminder for folks that are continue with us right now, just a reminder about the evaluation form that will automatically pop up in your browser once the event has ended. I'll just ask Mara if you could please move us on to the next slide. Before you close, I just want to invite you to the Learning Network's 2026 virtual forum, which will be bringing together practitioners, researchers, advocates to explore how artificial intelligence is both contributing to gender-based violence and also reshaping practice across the GBV and allied sectors. So we welcome you. We hope to see you there at the virtual forum. Registration continues to be open. That's February 3rd and 4th from 1 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. For the next slide, please, Mara, we also just want to invite you to join us for our next Learning Network and Knowledge Hub webinar titled Power and Control, Challenges in Implementing Trauma-Informed Approaches with Youth. The session will be taking place on Tuesday, February 17th, 2026 from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Um, this session is going to explore the practical and systemic challenges involved in implementing TVI approaches in youth settings. So more information and registration is open. I know that we're sharing it in the chat, and you can also find it on the Learning Network website. So thank you to everyone for being here with us today, for your support and ongoing engagement, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next event. Thank you very much.